Um, our very first speaker for today is Regan A.R. Gurung, who is the Associate Vice Provost and Executive Director at the Center for Teaching and Learning at Oregon State University, as well as a professor in the Department of Psychology. Prior to joining OSU, Regan was a longtime faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, and he received his PhD in social personality psychology from University of Washington in Seattle. Now, I first met Regan when I invited him to be a speaker at one of the earliest Psych 1 conferences all the way back in 2013. And I have to say that when I got my first faculty position, I really had Regan in mind as the role model for the kind of faculty member that I really, really wanted to be. First, Regan is an amazing teacher. He is beloved by his students and has won numerous teaching awards, including the Wisconsin Professor of the Year and the Charles L. Brewer Award for a distinguished career in teaching psychology from the APA. After hearing him speak for just a few minutes, you will understand why. Second, Regan's an amazing scholar. In addition to research in health and social psychology, he continuously publishes on the scholarship of teaching and learning, collaborating with lots of other scholars, and also involving undergraduate students in nearly all of his research. Third, Regan is a tireless supporter of other teacher scholars. He served as the founding co-editor of the journal Scholarship of Teaching and Learning in Psychology, has given tons of talks at teaching conferences like this one, and together with Garth Neufeld, led the American Psychological Association's Introductory Psychology Initiative, which means he wrangled a large team of educators in guiding a set of national recommendations for intro psych. And as a member of that team, I got to see firsthand what an inspiring and creative leader Regan is. He's a real beacon in our community, and we are super lucky to have him here today to share with us his take on vaccinating intro psych, building immunity with research and recommendations. Please join me in virtually welcoming Dr. Regan A.R. Gurung.
Woohoo! Thank you so much, Bridget. And give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, Bridget. Yes, you can see my screen. Always a nice little thing to ask, because when I taught remotely, there were definitely times when students were not seeing the screen I was seeing or hoping that they were seeing. So thank you for that absolutely stellar introduction. Gosh, I almost wanted to close my eyes and blush and turn my camera off, but really, really appreciate it. Appreciate all the work you're doing, and really appreciate the fact that we have people from all over the world here right now. Just absolutely, absolutely super to see you all. This is a thrill to be able to chat with you about this topic. A couple of quick things right off the bat. Yes, this will be recorded, but I'm really taking this opportunity to try and share with you as much cool stuff as possible. And because there's a lot of cool stuff, I'm sure some of you will go, wait a minute, what was that? So for your benefit right now, in the chat, I have put a link not only to all the slides for the presentation, but that link will also take you to a jam-packed set of resources that can help you teach intro psych. So just like Bridget said in the intro, that's one of the big goals of this conference, give you stuff to go away with. And good Lord, people, I want to give you stuff to go away with. And next to everything I reference in the next 55 minutes, and more is at that link right there. So if you have any problems with that link, let me know later. But everything's in there. If I'm going to show you some links to assignments, I'm going to share my assignments with you. It's all in that link. So hope that's useful, and looking forward to chatting about that a little bit. So woo, what a year it has been. What a year it has been. One of the upsides about looking through this year in COVID is seeing how psychology is everywhere, right? Even the NIMH recommendations has psychology all over the place. Take care of your body, connect with others. That's all vintage psychology. And I think I love the way, Bridget, great Spider-Man reference in the intro. Indeed, teaching intro psych does come with a lot of responsibility, because there is a lot of power. And there is a lot of power to get all this kind of information out there to so many individuals. Now, this point of the summer is a wonderful point for me, and I think it is for you. Apart from being absolutely exhausted from the last 12 months, there's enough time where I feel like we collectively can take some time to think about How do we want things to be different? And when I went through the pandemic, I just saw, I think for the first time, higher education took a real close look at teaching, a closer look at teaching than they ever did before, right? I mean, everybody was concerned about enrollment levels. And prior to this, yes, a lot of attention was paid to online classes, but what I saw was for the first time, administrators cared about how regular courses were taught. Wonderful. I hope we can take that attention to teaching and continue to do that as we go forward. So that gave me the thought for this this talk here, which was, what are all those things we learned from teaching during COVID? What did that close scrutiny of teaching do? And more importantly, to give you a big sense of what I want to do today, is how can we build immunity? Just like we all, I hope many of you have your vaccinations. I know how much stronger I felt once I got vaccinated, how much safer. It's sort of like that with teaching. How can we build our confidence as teachers? How can we immunize our courses to prevent it from big problems? So that's my plan today. 3 main parts. First, let's build immunity. Immunity from what? Immunity from a whole range of things. Let's, when I would like to cut down on how many students look like that in my class, who look bored, let's engage. How can we increase learning? So that's the idea I'm going to use here. Is there's so much good psychology. How can we build immunity to those problems that plague us in intro psych, right? The large classes, the engagement. How can we do it? How can we vaccinate our students? How can we vaccinate our classes so that they are stronger, so that they are healthier? That's my goal. So 3 main parts here. First, I'm going to take a little bit of time to reflect on some of the cool things we have learned from the pandemic, and more importantly, share some data on post-pandemic perceptions of students, something all of us need to keep in mind as we think about how we shape our classes for the fall. So really cool information from some neat national surveys there. Then I'm going to pull the camera back a little bit and talk about some conceptual issues, right? We're going to talk, when we are teaching large classes, what are some of those conceptual issues? What are some of those big pedagogical things that we need to keep in mind? When you saw the different sponsors of the conference in the first few minutes, you saw a lot of solutions. And in the middle part of this talk, I'm going to talk about what are the problems that those are the solutions for. So before we jump on and try a new technology or try a new app or a widget, what are those problems that we have to face in intro psych? I'm going to spend some time on those conceptual issues. And then in the end, let's get working, right? Those action items to nicely set the stage for the other bookend of today, the wonderful Missy Beer's workshop on pragmatics. I'm going to end my talk as a sort of throwing the pass to Missy there with some action items, some key things for us to think about as we think about intro psych. Okay, that's where we're going. That's where we're going. Hang on, let's roll. All right. So let's start here, right? Yeah, what are we really building immunity from? How do we strengthen our courses? What do we need to strengthen? Well, I think it's really important right off the bat to be very cognizant of what all of us, not just our students, but all of us have experienced during this last year. Be good to yourself. Take some time to rest, to rejuvenate. Self-care, it's really important, both for us and for our students. When we come back in the fall, there's going to be some excitement, but there's still going to be some remnants of a long time of wear and tear, right? At first, the nice thing about Zoom teaching was you could see faces without masks, right? We didn't have to worry about the distance. But what started like that very soon became that, right? I taught Gen Psych. I taught Gen Psych to close to about 250 students in the fall, 250 students. And yes, a lot of the time there were some faces, but pretty soon there was a lot of that. And there was tiredness because by the fall, they'd already been in pandemic teaching for quite some time. One of my favorite images from the class is Alexander, and shared with his permission. Just in case you're wondering, this is not Alexander sleeping during class, but because of self-care, I made sure that during class, I used a lot of mindfulness and relaxation breaks, right? Let's use our psychology. This is Alexander taking one of those mindfulness breaks, and he happened to leave his camera on, and I checked with him to make sure I could share this because this so captured the pandemic. As he said, this was the room where he spent close to 8 hours of his day. That chair, well worn as you could see, is where he spent the bulk of his day in remote classes. Wow. What a challenge for all of us. What a challenge for so many of our students. He made it through. He made it to every class, right? There were some upsides. I had a chat running all the time, just like I see the chat here. And I'll tell you, I learned a lot of things because the chat was open. Things I probably wouldn't have learned and haven't learned in a face-to-face class, right? For example, horns up. Very early on, in response to something I said, somebody typed up horns up in the chat, right? And for those of you who are wondering, that's the horns up symbol. At first, I was a little concerned. Whoa, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And of course, I quickly Googled and found out that horns up is pretty much the equivalent of rock on. And I'm like, oh, that's great, rock on. Well, indeed, psych is great, intro psych is great, let's rock on. Something else that I ran into that really amused me was slaps, right? And something else a student typed out was, oh, that really slaps. And again, I was a little worried, is that a good or bad? And quickly told that that is a good thing. It is a good thing. So if something slaps, that's a good thing. Well, gosh, I learned a fair amount as well. And of course, one of my favorite parts of remote teaching was all the pet pictures. That is our little puppy Katsu that I shared as together with many of the other pictures that we got from students. So yeah, we had opportunities there, right? But maybe you're wondering, yeah, that's all really nice with the chat and things like that. But what were students really doing? Let me tell you, I asked them. And here's a message for you all. When we teach intro psych, I think one of the main ways we can strengthen the teaching of intro psych is to really capture as much data as regarding what's going on in intro psych. One of my messages from this first part here is really, we need data. We need to know what's going on. And I collect a lot of data. Every term I assess my intro psych. We have every year, Oregon State has about 3,000 students enrolled in intro psych. We do some in-depth assessments. And one of the questions I was really interested in is what's going on during remote learning? And what you see here is I asked them to what extent they took part in a lot of these different activities. I just mentioned the strengths of chat. What you will notice here is that the majority of the class, and here I'm showing you those who said always, most of the time, or at least half of the time, the majority of the class kept their chat open, right? Kept their chat open, engaged. It was a really neat way to foster a community. The camera may not surprise you. Not that many kept their cameras on, right? About half the times, very few always. Some of the things I was particularly curious about is how many folks log in and then leave, right? And they fessed up on to what extent they worked on other classes, to what extent they were on social media. The roomies one is to what extent were you interacting with your roomies or family members during class? And you can see that's a pretty high percent, right? It's a pretty high percent. Key stuff for us to keep in mind. When we are in a face-to-face class looking out at 25, 50, 300, or 1,000, for the most part, we can see a lot of behaviors. In remote teaching, we couldn't. But so here's a little picture of what's going on over there. And what this says to me is that chat, the usage of chat and the interactions there really, really provides, I think, an opportunity for going forward. And for those of you going back to face-to-face, actually, when we go back to face-to-face, if you're wondering, hey, is there a way I can capitalize on back channel chatting? Is there a way to use it well? Ladies and gentlemen, folks, this is one of the things I think would be great to think about this summer is how can we capture what chat provides in a face-to-face setting without it being distracting, right? And for those of you on Twitter, just this morning, I tweeted, actually retweeted something from Sarah Kavanaugh, a great list of different back channel applications. So if you are one of those people going, how can I use chat a little bit more in my class? There's a list of apps there. I just got it just before this. So I will put that into the document for all of you to share. But again, email if you want that. So really key thing to keep in mind, this is what's going on. Yes, I do like data. I was really curious about fluctuations in attendance. This is attendance in my class. The red bar is number of students logged in at the start of class. The blue bar is the number of students at the end of class. And as you can guess, in almost every case, except for one, there was some droppage. It's an hour and 50-minute class. Most of the time, there were more students at the start of class than at the end, except for this crazy day here where, for whatever reason, there was this big jump up. You also see some classic patterns in intro psych, right? I have about a 250 enrollment, 260 enrollment. Did pretty well. This is the entire fall term, remote. And yeah, there was that classic drop, but for the most part, people were at least logging in. Now, to what extent they were there is a whole separate question that I showed you in the previous data, right? But they were at least logging in. And a key thing I want to say is having a better feel of this really helps you prep, maybe helps you target when are the times that we need to put more things into place than the others. Let's pull the camera back a little bit. Titan and Partners, this was Fox et al. 2021, put out some really nice research on some of the key faculty challenges. It will not surprise you that the top faculty challenge last year was keeping students engaged, right? How do I keep my students engaged? That's something I think that we face normally, but I think it's even trickier during remote teaching. And to some extent, when we have them back in front of us, I almost feel like now they're there, they don't have the distractions around them. Maybe that engagement will go back to being a little easier to do. That notwithstanding, we still have to make sure that we're thinking about engagement, because if you notice that, again, not surprisingly, one of the biggest issues that faculty kept in mind was engagement. More importantly, though, and I do think this next bit is really important, this data here collected more recently, it was just about 6-7 weeks ago, faculty, students, and administrators from all over the countryside. And I should say this data over here, about 8,000 faculty, over 1,000 students, nice, relatively representative sample, pretty good there. Here, another relatively large sample. And what's really neat about this data and something for all of us to think about is preferences for post-pandemic academic experiences. Okay, students were asked, now going back face-to-face, and for all of us teaching intro psych, check this out, people. All I have here is the strongly agree and somewhat agree. Look at those percentages. They want more digital resources, right? More technology in the fully in-person classes. Just because we go back to in-person doesn't mean that technology gets put aside. I think a lot of students saw all the neat technological ways to interact with class, many of which you saw in the promo section to start this conference, and they wanted more, right? Look at that preference. 68% want more technology in fully in-person courses, right? 68% may take more of their courses as a combination of in-person and online instruction. Now, again, just because they want some of that stuff, unless it fits a pedagogical problem, we don't just need to push it in there, but it's really something we need to think about. And I love this data here. Remember, folks, when you and I go back to intro psych in the fall, many of our students' perceptions and their expectations are going to be a little different. So to close part one, yes, the pandemic gave us a lot of lemons, but I'm telling you, I'm drinking a lot of lemonade. There's a lot of food for thought for all of us as we spend specifically the next 2 months of this summer thinking about how we're going to change our intro cycle. So let me give you some more food for thought, right? So I promised you some big picture items on intro psych. Let's talk about some of those. And for the next little bit, what I'm going to give you are some really big issues to think about. I will be upfront with you. There are going to be a lot of issues that we should be thinking about. It is going to be impossible, if not next to impossible, to tackle too many of these issues. But what I hope is that as you listen to some of these issues, you will prioritize which ones you want to work on in your class, right? Which of these different things would you like to focus on? Would you like to tackle for the fall? This is a picture of maybe 1/10 of my Gen Psych class. I cannot wait to get back to this room and see them in person again. And I keep this picture in mind as I plan my fall. And I'll admit, I am thinking about the fall. A large part of me just wanted to kick back, and actually I can look over my screens and look at my hammocks out there in the back. Large part of me wanted to just sit in the hammock, not think about anything with the exhaustion that I feel, but a little bit, small parts. And as Bob Boise said, start before you're ready to start. And I've been doing that. So hopefully this conference in Psych 1 will be that kind of something for you to give you those things to sort of incubate on over the next couple months. So instead of going through a whole bunch of research, very recently, Jana Hackenthorn and I, this is a 2019 article, really summarized as much research on intro psych as we can find. It's in the Teaching of Psychology. We have a list of questions for intro psych. We've reviewed a lot of research on there. For those of you who are used to lists of 10, you notice this one goes to 11. Lots of neat things for you to think about. And then really, if you're wondering what's out there, what's been done on intro psych, this article, 2019 in the Teaching of Psychology, will answer a lot of those questions for you. So that's there. Not going to revamp what's published in very explicit form. What I do want to talk about, though, I'll pull some big level issues for us to think about. Right? We cannot escape the fact that learning is complex. There is no, hey, magic bullet, right? And there are all these key components that I think we have to think about when we think about learning. As I look at my fall term, as I look at my falls, as I look at my syllabus and my learning outcomes, right? I'm thinking about study behaviors. I'm thinking about motivation. I'm thinking about self-efficacy. I'm thinking about active learning, right? These are some of the big ones, what's rising to the top. There are tons of variables, but when I look at all that's done out there, these are some of the areas that I can see the biggest bang for the buck. And I'm gonna give you some key research that ties to this. And the summary article should also be linked in my file, the one I talked about. If you're going, hey, what is that? And if not, again, if there's anything here that you run into, let me know. And thank you, Ken, for posting a link to that article right there. So if you're wondering, oh yeah, where is that summary article? Check out in the chat. It is right there. So all this stuff, right? Study behaviors, motivation, self-efficacy, we know it's important. Let me highlight for you some really key things that we may want to focus on. Again, like I said, having data on our classes is really important, not just for our planning, but to also convince our students as to why we're doing something. I still remember teaching my very first intro psych class in Green Bay. And at the end of the class, my evaluations, this was year one, circa a long time ago, they said, oh, there's so much busy work in the class. And then I realized that I hadn't made a case as to why they were doing that work, right? Classic rookie mistake. So the next time I taught the class, I made sure that I told my students and explained exactly why they have all these different assignments in there. Right? And mind you, I taught classes of 250. So again, if you're thinking, does the scale, most of what I will talk about will scale up, all right, will scale up. But all these issues are key. And how do you deal with some of these issues? Well, one big one is active learning. And you may know that active learning is like eating peas. Like it's good for students, but they don't want to do it. And one piece of data that I share with my students in class, and again, I don't just use the data for myself. Folks, I suggest sharing your data with your students, right? Share your data with your students, and this is something I share. Check this out. In this wonderful study, came out just a few years ago, they actually compared, they actually compared active learning and passive learning strategies. And in a very cool experiment, they had students experience active learning instruction for part of the class and passive learning instruction for part of the class. All right. And what's really important is check out the actual tests of learning here on the left and the student perceptions of learning here on the right. When you look at student perceptions of learning, students always preferred the passive learning. They wanted the passive learning. They liked it better. But when it came to the objective scores on the tests of learning, it was the active learning sections where the students did better. I share this with my students and say, look, some of the stuff you know, to quote one student, you may want to just sit back and write stuff down. But you know what? Look, if we care about learning, this is what the difference is. Okay? This is what the difference is. So active learning, think about ways, how can you make your class more active, right? How can you make your class more active? And again, in my last section, I'm going to give you some more specific tips, right? What about study behaviors? One of the things that in the APA's Intro Psych initiative, we spent a lot of time on study techniques. But when you look at the research, and of course, when you look at the wonderful John Dinlowski et al. 2013 article with, you know, a whole bunch of cognitive study techniques, you would think that the more students use certain study techniques, the better they'll do. But it's challenging. I mean, I have tried very hard to get my students to use study techniques better. Actually, there's a great recent article in the Teaching of Psych by Carolyn Brown Kramer on her intervention to increase study skills. And I've tried it too. This article is in press. It's published online. It's in press in the Teaching of Psych. And we tried to predict learning. And what's interesting about the next couple of articles I'm going to show you, this was all data collected during the pandemic, right? This was a study we did last spring, right when the pandemic hit. Another study coming up was in the fall. And we tried to say, how can we increase learning in intro psych? And we took all the usual suspects, right? We measured study techniques and perseverance and metacognitive skills. And what we found was that at the end of the day, none of those usual suspects, retrieval practice and spacing practice, none of them really predicted exam scores. And the nice thing here, ladies and gentlemen, folks, here is objective exam score. So this is not self-perceptions of learning. Here we have the actual scores on the exam. And what we found was that those actual scores on the exam were significantly correlated, zero-order correlations with self-explanation and the use of keywords, right? Elaboration was but you know, not as highly correlated, but that was it. Keywords and self-explanation were the only significant zero-order correlations, right? GPA is always the big predictor. Students' GPA predicted self-explanation and elaboration as well, and the use of mental images for studying. But here's the kicker. Here's what really gets me. We know about study techniques, but when I try to predict exam scores using a multiple regression, study techniques did nothing. I look back at myself and go, maybe I'm not helping them use study techniques enough. Okay. Note to all of us, we know some study techniques work, right? But how can we get our students to use them better, right? How can we get our students to use them better? And maybe, you know, there's a very fun side discussion with, do those study techniques just work in the lab, but not in the classroom? That's another fun conversation, isn't it? But the reality is, if study techniques are big and we put a lot of effort into it, and Steve Chu and his group in the Intro Psych initiative spent a lot of time with it and provide great resources for it, and I'll share in 15 minutes, right? But let's see it predicting learning. Clearly, we've got to do better, okay? Now, yes, study techniques, yes, active learning. Here's another really funky one that I learned about during the pandemic. And again, boy, learned so much lemonade from those lemons during the pandemic. This study also in press, Ariana Stone and I really looked at what predicted learning during the pandemic. And what we found, I think, has some really nice implications for, again, how we go back in the fall. We found we really focused on the fit of the class to the modality. And you know, since we're all going back face to face, that's not as important. What I want to focus on, though, is the self-efficacy, right? And I think we all have heard about self-efficacy, clearly, right? Good old Bobudol et al. But what we found is the self-efficacy was a significant predictor of learning in the classroom, right? We divided students up. We asked students, how well do you think you will do in remote teaching versus as compared to your face-to-face classes? And what we found was you could carve nature at its joints. The students who said, hey, modality doesn't make a difference, you know, did scored significantly higher. That's the blue bar than the students who said, oh no, I don't do well on online classes. Just that experience that online is not good, that it's not good for them, significantly influenced their learning. Immediately, again, I found this out. This was data that I got from the spring, immediately turned around, and I changed last fall by having a letter that went out to students directly addressing self-efficacy. Now, did it make a difference? That's sort of hard to compare, but self-efficacy is a big deal. And I think whatever you and I can do to address self-efficacy is really key, especially in large intro classes, especially this fall, when there are so many students coming in after a very gray type of year. So I think self-efficacy, very, very big deal, right? And we took that a little further. Some data that we have right now, both these studies, by the way, the sample sizes, the last three studies, the sample size is a little over 200, 250 or so. Once we found that self-efficacy was such a big deal, we wondered if self-efficacy would also moderate stress during the pandemic. And again, I don't think enough of us think about the stress that students are under, pandemic or no pandemic. I mean, that taking that holistic approach, I think is so important. If you can, and sparing the cognitive mental energy for it, I think cannot be underplayed. But right, so there's stress everywhere. But does that same perception of self-efficacy actually influence their stress? And what we found was indeed, and here we use we looked at the correlations between low self-efficacy, between stress and learning for the two groups, low self-efficacy and high self-efficacy, and strong evidence for moderation by self-efficacy, whether it's stress, whether it's the use of positive coping strategies, whether it's the use of negative coping strategies. So again, self-efficacy. That's my challenge, is how can I build self-efficacy this fall? How, if you build self-efficacy, please share it, because self-efficacy is such a big deal. And we've got to figure out how we can help our students really deal with that. A few other fun things as we go back, and the other ones are fun, as we go back to face-to-face, some really cool articles to check out as we think about things. When we go back face-to-face, and this is one of the things I realized when we were remote, is actually, especially remote, was difficult, but being synchronous still was so good. And when we go back face-to-face, here's something key to keep in mind: synchrony. Right? That being face-to-face, let's capitalize on it. And one of the big things to watch for is watching people's eyes. Now, I know it's sort of hard in a very large class, but I love this study by Madsen et al. That basically showed that when students' eyes were synchronized, when they were all looking at the same thing at the same time, and they did some really funky stuff to measure this. They showed them videos of star clusters. They actually mapped eye tracking, and then they looked at eye movement and pupil size, a whole bunch of funky stuff. And they found that whenever all the students were looking at the same thing at the same time, their learning on those items was higher when the eye movement were not synchronized. And this gets into that category of when I look out there at my 200 students, watch for those times that they are all paying attention versus all not. And that's another challenge for us, is how can we get our students to pay more attention? Because clearly synchrony and everybody synchronizing together goes a long way. So again, notice I'm giving you these fun challenges for the fall, right? Also paying attention to what students are doing in this, hey, we're going back to face-to-face. Here's another area for you to think about, the wonderful area of attention contagion. Oh, this scared me when this came out, right? I love this. Again, very recent article in Journal of Experimental Psychology. They manipulate, in this study, Foreign and colleagues manipulated, brought pairs of students into the lab. One was a Confederate, and they had the Confederate either pay attention or appear distracted. And lo and behold, based on what the Confederate was doing, significantly influenced the behavior of the participant. And you see this in test scores, right? And that's key. Not only did the participants with a distracted Confederate fidget more, not only were they less attentive, not only did they take down fewer words from the lecture they were listening to, they did not do as well on a test as well. Some data that I know for sure that in this fall I am going to share with my students. And again, when I talk about this kind of data, most of the last couple of slides, I will share probably the first day of class to create a culture of what good learning in intro psych can be. One last thing, many of us get focused in on one person. If cameras were on right now, undoubtedly I'd be spending more time looking at the person smiling and nodding at me. Make sure you look everywhere, right? In this other study, very often this data shows that this is Goldenberg et al. This data shows that very often, especially as class size increases or crowd size increases, we tend to focus in on one person's extreme reactions and misgauge the entire class. So make sure you're looking at everywhere. Just because you see one person who looks really down, don't assume everybody's not getting what you're saying. By the same token, just because you're looking at, as we often do, the attentive, engaged student, don't assume everybody's getting it, right? Don't assume everybody's getting it as well. So some really, really key stuff to keep in mind, especially as we go back to face-to-face classes, okay? Lots of stuff. You pick. What do you want to get on? What do you want to get into? How much attention, how much bandwidth do you have to pay attention to these physical type of things going on in your classroom? For those of us who would teach large classes, for better or for worse, these kind of issues, especially the attention contagion, these kind of issues could be a large factor in what's going on and influencing learning. All right, so let's tackle some action items. All right, let's tackle some action items. What can we work on? What am I going to be working on in the next couple of months as we go towards the fall? Here are some things to think about. Let me start with a really big deal. If you haven't run into the following research, here's an easy way to get updated. Don't fret about labs, right? We are a long way from the Mueller and Oppenheim 2014. The most recent research, this is Uri and colleagues, wonderfully shows that some of that early work doesn't replicate. I have summarized the history of the laptop or longhand research in this short Psych Today post. If you want to just Google the Psych Today post and my name, you'll see a very easy summary. This one is tricky because it's really easy to say, I mean, I was somebody who some years ago banned laptops from the classroom based on that 2014 research. And as I looked at note-taking more, as I looked at distractions more, I clearly found that that's just not the way to go. my take-home message to start this section is really don't fret about laptops. Yes, I talked about attention contagion, right? And if somebody is buying hamster collars on their laptop next to you, that looks like a distraction. I say, try and focus on the good use of laptops, the better use of laptops, try to focus on the notion of attention cognition, have our students take responsibility for what's going on in that classroom way better than just banning laptops outright. So again, that's been something that a lot of people go back and forth on. If you are somebody who's banned laptops because the research said so, you no longer have that foot to stand on because the research no longer says so. Here's something else I want to tackle. You know, we poo-poo lecturing all the time. And I said active learning is important, but I think we make the mistake to assume that active learning means not lecturing, right? So first off, apart from the fact that that crazy triangle, students learn 10% from lecturing, is a myth, there are so many different ways to lecture. And I know growing up, you know, I can remember watching that first Indiana Jones movie and thinking, wow, look at the attention on those students. When if I'm ever a professor, that's the kind of attention I want. And of course, it's more than that, right? But there are ways to build your lecturing skills. And here's something, if you haven't run into, is a very easy way to start. Something called interactive lecture. And again, lots of details on exactly what interactive lecturing is at that bit.ly short link. One of my wonderful staff at the Center for Teaching and Learning put together a great handout, and you'll see some more of that in the next couple of slides. But if you are curious about how to make your lectures or class time more interactive, use what's often referred to as the interactive lecture. And very much there's the main parts, 3 parts: pre-planning, the process, and then the closing, right? The pre-planning is you thinking about make sure you think about inclusive teaching, right? Making sure you think about just-in-time teaching and flipping. The process is something neat to think about too. It's almost like a script for your class, right? Have some social time, something that was particularly key during the pandemic. But then try and think of a good hook or set. Try and have what's referred to as a naive task, a task where students can use their pre-existing knowledge on something new, something fun, something challenging that nicely gets them ready to take in what you're going to be talking on that day. And of course, try and use 15-minute blocks interspersing different activities. Then don't forget about the consolidated. So again, if you're looking for ways to change your classroom script, check out interactive lecturing. Really, really neat suggestions there as you think about class sessions for the fall. I mentioned being inclusive. This is more and more important. It's always been important, but finally in the last year, we've spent a lot more time in higher education thinking about it. And this goes back to, you know, selecting diverse authors. Of course, if you haven't read Vijay Sathi and Hogan's article on being more inclusive, Run, Don't Walk, I've linked that in the document that I sent you the link for. Really, really key ways to be more inclusive. And I think it's not just, I mean, selecting diverse authors is a great first step, but something that I like to point attention to is watch your examples. Watch your examples. I know that when I taught in Green Bay, it was easy to use football examples. Football examples are big here in Oregon, right? Football examples or sports examples bias some groups versus the others. Yeah, you can favor international students by talking about soccer and discussing all the cool soccer action going on right now in Europe, but that's not hitting everybody. By the same token, you make some references that are only referring to some subgroups, well, you're missing out others. So even examples, think about those examples you use, think about those examples that you throw out. Are a really big deal. And as Bridget so nicely modeled at the start of this, establish rules of civility. Very, very key, especially if you are using, if you are somebody who's going to use a form of chat or back channel, or if you teach online, establishing those rules of civility are so important. I think closely related to being inclusive is a very nice deal, is humanize. Michelle Pacansky Brock, more in the context of online, but quite honestly, something that applies to even face-to-face teaching is really thinking about how can we humanize our course. And I like the notion and the specific suggestions here. But when we look out at intro psych, as we look out at our very large classes, let's humanize it some more. And there are some wonderful examples. And again, a full link to a great article on humanizing in the handout that I shared earlier on. And that, because some of you maybe really earlier on, I will share again right now. There you go. So again, in the chat, handout with all this kind of stuff in there, but think about humanizing. And I think one of the best places where you can establish that tone is in your syllabus. Amy Nussbaum recently published in Teaching of Psychology a wonderful study on how you can make your syllabus more humane, more welcoming. And I love the first part there. Kindness at first sight, right? Your syllabus can play a large role in how your students see your class. It sets the tone. I think more and more schools, we are being pushed to launch our class even before the first day. Remember, that means if your student is seeing your learning management system before the first day of class, your syllabus, maybe the very first view they have of you and the take they're going to get off you. So spend some time on your syllabus. In my lab, we did some work where we nicely replicated some earlier work on the importance of a warm tone, and something that I'm particularly intrigued by, we tested whether having what we call a reach out statement made a difference. Oregon State has all faculty put in a reach out statement. It essentially says college is stressful. If you have any problems, here are some numbers you can call. Here are some resources. And we tested whether having a reach out statement in the syllabus made a difference in how the instructor was seen. And whereas it wasn't an across the board makes a big difference, we found some strong positive effects for that. So especially as you think about your syllabus for the fall for intro psych, the power of that syllabus cannot be understated. And I think that's maybe not half the battle won, but maybe you can do so much to set the right tone by tweaking your syllabus. And here are just a couple of things to look for. A really nice theme is engage broadly, right? Engage broadly. That link over there, that bit.ly link over there will give you 60 different activities that you can try in the classroom. Right there, your conference money in that link right there, all right? It relies on UDL, and I will say right off the bat that I personally see UDL as something with, in quotes, research promise. I don't think a lot of the UDL ideas have been tested. That said, some of the basic prescriptions make good sense and relate to the psychology of motivation, and relate to the psychology of choice, and relate to building self-efficacy. So when I look at my classes, I push myself to engage learners in different ways and present information using different methods and providing multiple options for knowledge expression. And I don't necessarily buy it's connected to these neural pathways, but wow, I like pushing myself to design my intro course to do these kind of things. Whole bunch of good stuff, whole bunch of good references. Where should you start? Well, I think a really good place to start is student learning outcomes. And when we think about the introductory psychology course, yes, for 3 long years, Bridget and Missy and 18 other individuals worked long and hard as part of the APA Introductory Psych Initiative to come up with good recommendations for the course. Right off the bat, if you are wondering what are the student learning outcomes, the latest set endorsed by APA's Board of Educational Affairs and going up to APA's Council of Representatives. And any of you who are on the Council of Reps, watch for this coming down the pike. Always, as far as backward course design goes, the first place to start, of course, is student learning outcomes. And what's really important here, folks, is when you look at these student learning outcomes, a really key point is that third set, those themes. This is what makes psychology special. That responsibility, that power of the intro psych course, it's in those key themes. Big shout out to Jane Hallinan and Eric Landrum, and Chris Wetlock and Jennifer Thompson and Sue France for coming up, for working long and hard on these student learning outcomes. What a great guide for us to think about how we do intro psych. And I'll be honest, what a big challenge. I look at this and I go, wow, I've really got to work harder this summer to make sure that I can get my students to get these student learning outcomes, right? And the big thing here is notice, we downplay content, right? That's what I love about these student learning outcomes. It's downplaying content. You don't have to cover 16 chapters or 14 chapters. Unshackle yourself from content. Yeah, there are some guidelines for content. Way back in an early task force, we said, look, there are 5 piles of content areas in intro psych. Pull at least 2 topics from each of those main domains, but focus on these learning outcomes. Use whatever content you want. Use whatever content you want, but look at the themes, right? And this is what's neat about this is, as long as you have 10 topics across those 5 domains, you're giving your students the breadth of psychology. But by instead having the prize that your eyes are on be these student learning outcomes, I think we're doing the more powerful thing, right? Getting our students to really use this. And the great news about, one of the really neat things about these APA SLOs and the Intro Psych Initiative is there's a very close concordance between high school psychology and the college intro class. I mean, we've had the college board pay close attention to this. The national standards for high school psychology are currently in their final stages of revision, and they are very parallel to our recommendations with this the APA IPI outcomes. So really very, very different. This is not a please cover all 16 chapters. No, it's a focus on the magic of psychology. It's these themes right here. Yes, the first one has some content, right? But when we look at the fall, people think about those themes. That's where I think the true power is. Okay. There's a lot more. There are a lot more really helpful tips for you at the APA Intro Psych Initiative webpage that you'll find these student learning outcomes. There's wonderful work from Bridget's group on course design. There's wonderful work from Missy's group on student training. And also look at that last link on the screen. Stephen Chu's group did a lot of work on study skills. And as I said about 25 minutes ago, I think we can do better. I think we can do better with giving our students study skills. There's a great lesson plan for improving study skills that's available for free. And again, hot linked in the document that I gave you. Wonderful guidelines right there. And of course, exactly something that if you hang on for just a little bit more, when the wonderful Missy Beers, as I like to say, does her workshop, you will get a lot more specifics on these outcomes, on course design, on selecting items and assignments. One of the last things I want to mention, I shared that, yes, maybe even in the hammock, I'm going to modify my assignments. That's my big challenge. I mean, I love the student learning outcomes. That's my challenge for this summer, is how do I modify my assignments to really get to those student learning outcomes? One of the things I already have in my class is a visionary science application paper. And again, for those of you who haven't clicked on the link yet, I have in the link at the end, after page 1, I have all the application applied activities for my intro psych class. They are a work in progress. With humility, I share that with you, saying there's a lot, they are a work in progress. Some of them need a lot of work. If you make it better, if you come up with, please share. I'm working on rubrics for them. But that's my big challenge is, here are these great themes. How can I get to it? That's just what you see on your screen right now is just one of them. Lots of different stuff. And they span about 10 chapters. Yeah, I use the guideline, right? At least 10 topics. Lots of fun stuff that you'll see in there. Some more in need of reworking than others, but that is my current to-do list for the next couple of months. So check those out. And while you do, this, ladies and gentlemen, this, folks, is a wonderful time to really think about how we grade, right? There's specification grading, which really says just grade whether they hit what you want or not. A whole new movement that's getting a lot of discussion is ungrading. I have a blog post that I believe I put into the link on grading, and with all these links right here, before you go too much further in your syllabus, think about grading. Have you always done it the same way? Do you need all those levels of A's and B's and C's and D's and E's and F's and pluses and minuses? I don't know, and that's what I'm going to think about right now. But the specifications grading and the ungrading writing really gives me a lot of food for thought. And my jury is still out, but I'm working on it. As I close, I'd like to invite you to join the community that's out there. I have a web page that is a hub for intro psych and pedagogical research. The link is in the handout. What's neat about it is firstly, if you would like to measure some of those cognitive variables in your students, the scales and more section has a whole bunch of commonly used measures for psychology and particularly useful for intro psychology. So whether you're doing the scholarship of teaching and learning on your classes, or whether you just want to know what's going on with your students, check out the scales and more on this site. Lots of stuff there. If you'd like to collaborate with other folks on intro psych, there's a collaboration link, and just under the welcome page, there's a resource drop down with a whole bunch of very, very cool resources out there. Also, and much more recently, I created there are some of the big shout out to the wonderful, wonderful, wonderful members of the APA Intro Psych Initiative group. I stole that picture from my Facebook hub for Intro Psych. It's a community that I just recently started and that's growing, and it's a wonderful place to chat about Intro Psych, no matter where in the world you are. So I invite you to find us on Facebook and join the group. Whole bunch of fun stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for hanging on for the last hour to a healthy intro psych. Wonderful to be here with you. And I will hand back to Bridget. Thank you so much, Bridget. Thank you so much, all of you who joined me here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Regan. That was so incredibly useful. And I know I told you to ignore the chat so you could focus on your talk, but there were so many great ideas and questions. And I do want to take just at least a chance to ask you one of the questions that seem to come up as a common theme in the chat. And I think we'll still all have time for a little bit of a brain break before our next session today. So one of the things that many people were asking and wondering about relates to exams, which is a topic that you didn't have a chance to cover, although it feels like it covered everything else. Many of us made a pivot this past year to doing open note take-home exams with stronger application focus, right? Which sounds great. But many of us have observed that it has changed the way that our students study. So they seem to be focusing and have been learning more to prepare how to find information when they need it, as opposed to preparing themselves to retain the information without looking at it. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about what things might look like in the fall when students make a switch back, whether we should make a switch back to normal closed note exams. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great point. So as timing would have it, when I moved to Oregon State, and basically one of the reasons I moved was to direct the Gen Psych program and really, be able to modify and tweak Intro Psych. And one of the big changes we made was we moved from the Scantron exams to online exams. So that happened perfectly timed with the pandemic. And we did move to open book and so on. And of course, we put a bunch of stuff in place like timing and pulling a whole bunch of stuff. There is a very interesting literature on why timing is not a good idea. But again, that's a subtopic. But to directly address your question, though, I think a better way to go, there are two things for all of us to keep in mind. Number one is that the research clearly suggests that when students study for cumulative exams, they study differently than if they're just studying for an exam on a small bunch of stuff. So whether it's open book or not, I think making sure our exams are cumulative is probably a top priority. Secondly, I think one of the ways I have switched and what makes sense to do a quick in my head summary of ungrading and specification grading and assessment and things like that, I think, and to tackle your question, your concern that you raised or that has been raised, I think it's having more, and actually interesting enough, this is those provide multiple opportunities for assessment. I think that's the kind of stuff is don't put so much of the onus on those multiple choice exams, provide. And I'll say this as somebody who has an enrollment of 395 students for this fall. Put writing examples in there and speak to me if you think that is mind-bogglingly crazy. It's not, because there are ways to deal with writing assignments. And I'll say I'll say right here, you don't have to grade all of it. And nicely blending in specifications grading, if you use the specifications grading, you can do, hey, did your little essay hit the specification or not? And our learning assistants, our GTAs can do a lot of that. So especially if you have a large class, even if you have, I think, more writing to get students to chew on the material automatically makes us not tiptoe, but stride towards those new APA SLO learning outcomes. So again, you're absolutely right. We can spend a whole day talking about it, really cool stuff, but that's my first take.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Regan. I want to make sure everybody gets like a 10-minute brain break before we get going again. But I'm hoping, of course, Regan's going to stick around for a little bit. So if you have other questions, you can pop those in the chat. He may want to scroll back and look at some of the fascinating things that people were sharing and asking about. But again, thank you again. And we're going to take a little break, and I'll see everybody again in about 10 minutes.